Hello to my beloved students. This is Ethan Howard again, your hopefully beloved instructor, and it's often been said that sequels cannot be better than the original, but we are going to test that tonight with lab number 2, the sequel to lab number 1. So in lab number 2, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to focus in on vector data, and we're going to talk about different file types within vector data. So if we remember, just to recap, vector data is geospatial data comprised of either points, lines, or polygons. Okay, so if we're talking about representing real-world locations or features using points, lines, or polygons, you know then that we're talking about vector data. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the different concepts within vector data. So you guys have already seen a couple vector data sets. If you remember in the lab, we looked at those shape files. Well, just a generic vector data set, so any vector data set is called a feature class. Okay, so that's a generic term for any vector data set. It's called a feature class. And so an example of a feature class would be those shape files that we saw during lab. And so if you remember, the shape files had a green symbol next to them, and it showed us what kind, whether they were a point, line, or polygon. And when we looked at that shape file using our catalog, you'll remember that it showed up as one file. But when we looked at it using File Explorer, we saw that it was actually 5 to 8 different files. And instead of having the green symbol next to it, it then had that generic Windows gray symbol. And then it had the name with a different extension on the end of the name. So if our shapefile was called roads, we would see roads.shp, roads.shx, roads.aux, .dbf, .prj, and so forth. You don't have to remember those extensions yet, but just remember the concept that a shapefile is actually multiple files all seen as one file in our catalog. So what will happen is somebody will try to email a shapefile to somebody else, and then when they use the attach function on the email, it actually shows the attachment in File Explorer, and so they attach only one of the files instead of all of them, and so then the file doesn't work when the person gets it on the other end. That's important to keep in mind because it's actually a common mistake. Shape files are actually they're an older file type. They've been around for about 20 years, and ArcGIS is slowly moving away from them, but they're still pretty handy because they are so simple to use. And so we will be using them for the first couple weeks here in class, and then we'll move on from them. But they are still used. They're just slowly being phased out. And so this file type here is another type of feature class. Remember, shapefiles are feature classes, and so are coverages. I'm not going to talk much about coverages because they are totally antiquated. They've been replaced by newer file types. You still might run into them some. We have some in the GIS lab on the Y drive. But it's just important to remember that a coverage is a type of feature class, even though you won't be seeing them in this class. And now we move on to the kind of the new kid on the block, to say, even though it's been about 15 years since they've been used more predominantly, and those are geodatabases. And so the geodatabase has a symbol that looks kind of like a can of tuna. And that's pretty helpful, because what it actually shows is that the geodatabase itself is a container, okay? So the geodatabase is more like a folder that holds shapefiles, or a container that holds shapefiles. Oh, excuse me, not shapefiles, feature classes. So geodatabase is a container that can hold feature classes. And there's two types of geodatabases. There's the personal geodatabase, which has the extension .mdb, and there's what's called a file geodatabase, which has the extension .gdb. Okay, and so why would you pick one over the other? Well, we see over here that with the personal geodatabase, they can be edited and manipulated using what's called Microsoft Access, which is a database software program. But their kind of downside is they have a storage limit, and they're a little bit older, so they're actually not used as often, but they do have a limit for how much data you can actually put inside them. Where with a file geodatabase, the newest kind, they can no longer be, they have an extension of .gdb, but they can no longer be manipulated in Microsoft Access, but they have no storage limit. And with data sets becoming larger and larger as we gather more data, it's very important to have that capacity to just load them. So like I said, I said that inside the geodatabases, you can have feature classes. And so you would have your geodatabase. It has the symbol. And let's call it, we would maybe call it roads. And so if it was a file geodatabase, you would see roads.gdb. And if I double clicked it, I would then see the feature classes that are inside there, and they have a gray symbol. And so say this was like street signs or something like that. So we signs, and then we might have one that has lines, and it's you know, main roads, major roads. And so forth. So you can stack a bunch of feature classes inside this geodatabase, and that actually gives you more functionality that we'll talk about later in the class. But it's important to remember that these are feature classes, but they are not shape files. And so even if you import a shape file into the geodatabase, it is no longer a shape file. There's a conversion that takes place, and it's just called a feature class. So these are called geodatabase feature classes. These are feature classes, but you would never call these shape files. That's actually a big no-no, which I misspoke earlier and called them that. I'm a little bit embarrassed I did so. But yeah, these are geodatabase feature classes. And now a geodatabase, the newer geodatabases, one of their functionalities is they can also hold rasters now. So if something's inside the geodatabase, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a feature class, but they have a lot of functionality that you can set up that we'll see a little bit later on in the term. It's just important to remember that you're going to run into mostly shapefiles and geodatabase feature classes when doing vector data analysis in GIS. So I know it's a pretty short little lecture. It's just on the different file types. Lecture number 3, we'll just keep moving. And we'll start talking about some different ideas about how the file types operate once they're in ArcGIS. So I hope that helps. Give this lecture a view if you're an online student or a remote student. I'm also going to post the lab number 2 and then the trial by fire number 2 also. And so those are things that you can work through on your own. And so I hope that helps. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.